Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. We'll begin in about 1 minute. We'll just wait for a couple of people more to join, and then we'll begin. Our panelists are ready, and we're really excited about moving forward with this webinar today. Very good. Okay, let's see here now. Very good. Here we begin. Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar, The Future of the EU After the Coronavirus, Cohesion, Solidarity, and Thickening of Integration. This is the second of two events by the Colorado European Union Center of Excellence at the University of Boulder in honor of Europe Day, which is tomorrow, May 9th. I'm Felicia Naranjo Martinez. I'm the Center's Executive Director, and I'll be your moderator today. We are honored to welcome our esteemed panelists, Istvan Seke, Principal Advisor of from the European Commission, DG ECFIN, which is Economics and Finance, and EU Fellow at the University of Colorado in Boulder. Then we have Ignacio Garcia Bercero, Director, EU Commission, and EU Fellow at the University of Oxford. We also have Karen van der Kolff, Head of Unit at the European Commission, DG Justice and Consumers, and EU Fellow currently at UC Berkeley. Also, we have on hand Nicolai Veron. Nicholas is a Senior Fellow and co-founder of Bruegel in Brussels and is a Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, D.C. Welcome to all of our panelists. I'd like to begin with a couple of quotes. To quote his recent discussion paper, COVID-19, a turning point for the EU, Herman van Rompuy, President of the European Policy Center and President Emeritus of the European Council, says, "The enemies of the EU have a point when they ask where the Union was at the beginning of the crisis. The answer is paradoxical and simple. Yes, there was too little EU, but that's because it is not a superstate. Even though the Union has no competencies in health or social matters, everyone expected that there would be much more coordination on the necessary restrictive measures. And once again, one already sees purely national strategies for the exit from quarantine." Then from another article written by Jean Berkim, Europe's hidden weapon in combating COVID-19, the single market. While not in the public eye as much as, say, the European Central Bank's pandemic purchase program, a series of single market-related measures taken by the European Commission have shown that the EU has been able to act effectively and rapidly in areas of EU competence. Measures have been taken to ensure the lifting of national export bans, continued circulation of goods and essential services, and bolstered manufacturing of medical equipment. Discussions or decisions have also been taken to equip member states with the necessary flexibility to provide unprecedented levels of state aid and support to their respective economies. So, my first question is to you, Nicolai. Given the varying fiscal capacities among EU countries to support their economies, the lack of willingness on the part of net contributors to pay more after Brexit, and the emerging conflict with the Central and Eastern European member states on reducing traditional forms of funding to free up resources for new priorities, will the pandemic and the subsequent economic crisis help advance the economic monetary union reforms, or will the opposite happen? And how would the deepening of financial integration, particularly the banking union and capital market union, help the EU to address this crisis? And will this crisis environment help or hinder this process? What do you think, Nicolai?
Well, lots of questions, and there's a lot to unpack here. I'll try my best in a few minutes. But first, thanks for having me, and my apologies on behalf of Bruegel, because initially Bruegel's director, Guntram Wolf, was scheduled to participate here. So I'm standing in for him in a way, but very delighted to be in this group. I'll say a few things. One, I think one thing we learned in the last 10, 12 years is that the European Union, and within it the Eurozone, are resilient. They're probably more resilient than many of us thought. Remember 2012, 2015, all the concerns about Eurozone breakup. The mere fact of survival, in a way, is an achievement, something that couldn't be taken for granted, and that tells us something, that teaches us something about the nature of the EU. Of course, on the flip side, there is Brexit, the possibility of reversibility of membership, at least for member states which are not in the Eurozone. But here again, I think one of the big surprises of Brexit, which has taken certainly me by surprise, but I think many other observers, is how little contagion there has been from the UK precedent. Basically, there is, even in the current difficult circumstances, no member states that wants to emulate the UK. We'll see if that continues to be the case. But I think these are significant observations in a context where there is always no shortage of commentators who are there to predict that the EU will collapse tomorrow morning. The second point is expectations. I think, not to be too positive here, and I think the magnitude of the challenges is clear, and I'll come back to them, but the fact that people are so frustrated with the lack of a fiscal response of the EU in countries like Italy, for example, tells us also something about the expectations on the EU. I'm not sure it would have been the case 20 or 30 years ago that the Italian public in an event like this one would have actually expected solidarity from the EU in the form of massive fiscal transfers, which is the current situation, because clearly small fiscal transfers are not enough. It has to be massive to meet expectations. Now, of course, that has a negative impact, which is, as these transfers don't come, there is disappointment, and that's the current situation. But I think the very existence of those high expectations, the fact that they are considered normal, tells us something about what the EU has become. Now, third point in introduction, in the reaction to the COVID-19 pandemic, the EU doesn't look good. And you are right to say it's been mostly national reactions. And I will add, in most member states, certainly in the southern half of the EU, national reactions which haven't been very stellar. There is a lot of disappointment of public opinions with the national responses not in all countries, for example, not in Greece, not in Portugal, generally speaking, but in many countries, including my own. I'm French. But the kind of plain obvious truth is that nobody looks very good, whether in the EU or outside of the EU. The only countries that really look good are a very limited number of East Asian democracies which had gone through SARS, so mainly South Korea and Taiwan, and they look good, but not that many other countries look good right now in terms of pandemic response. So I think the shortcomings of the responses in the EU have to be put in this context. Now to your questions. There are a number of challenges that the pandemic raises for Europe. Fiscal challenges, but also in terms of monetary policy, in terms of financial sector policy, in terms of the legal framework, and in terms of course, of politics. It's too early to make a judgment. There have been relatively few decisions so far, except in the area of monetary policy and banking supervision, because the ECB there is a very strong authoritative institution. But I think the rest is mostly a work in progress. Starting with fiscal. As you mentioned, there is an ongoing discussion among EU member states, including but not limited to the Eurozone, on what is the right collective fiscal response to what is happening. The combination of that discussion and of the actions of the ECB has actually created a lot of fiscal space for even the fiscally weakest member state. So if you look at Italy, it's not self-evident, we can discuss about it, but it's not self-evident that Italy has responded to the pandemic shock in a way that was constrained in terms of the size of the fiscal response. So the fact that Italy has high debt and is fiscally stretched doesn't show in the magnitude of the response to the pandemic, at least not obviously. So in a way that's a success, tentatively, but the big question is how long does it last? Is there a moment when the pressure on debt sustainability and fiscal sustainability on Italy constrains what they can do to mitigate the shock and prepare the recovery? And if so, when does that point come, if, as I would argue, it hasn't come yet? Lots of questions here. I'm sure we'll come back to them in our debate, so I don't want to be too long. I'll just go quickly through the other areas. Monetary policy, I think we've seen the ECB go very far and basically being unconstrained by almost anything in the interpretation of their mandate, including the recent ruling, controversial ruling of the German Constitutional Court, which I think has profound implications for the legal order, and I'll come to it in a minute, but do not put an effective constraint on what the ECB is doing either now or in the foreseeable future. Banking and financial sector framework, it's not been the most heavily covered aspect in the media, but the supervisory response of the ECB by allowing banks to use capital buffers, by giving them this kind of capital relief and a number of other actions has actually been very strong and very impactful in terms of economic effect, and has participated in the fact that we've seen actually not a credit contraction, but a credit expansion in the last few weeks, which is very positive in terms of policy response to the crisis. Now, the big question going forward is whether the crisis will hinder or accelerate the completion of the banking union and the buildup of a capital markets union. I think it's far too early to answer those questions. At this point, we simply don't know. There was an active conversation in 2019 on completing the banking union. If there hadn't been for the crisis and the pandemic, it's possible, but not certain, that this would have led to decisions to complete the banking union or to move in that direction, for example, on things like deposit insurance, on the treatment of sovereign exposures, on the bank restructuring and resolution framework in the course of 2020. We will simply never know, because now we're in a different course of history. And the question again is, what will be the impact on that conversation? I think it will be massively past dependent. So it will depend on decisions on crisis management. And the big question here is, can the banks survive through the crisis without raising new capital? So will the prudential buffers and the government guarantees on the number of exposures be sufficient so that banks can absorb the losses that come and, to use a metaphor that others have used, can cross the desert without having to refuel? Nobody knows. It depends on the magnitude of the desert, and nobody knows that. So too early to answer that question. Legal, of course, the German Constitutional Court's ruling is a challenge to the EU legal order. We've seen the response of the European Court of Justice this morning. There is a big commotion in legal circles because of this unprecedented ruling. I insist on the fact that in terms of the monetary policy course and in terms of possibly anything else that's concrete and practical, it doesn't change anything now. So it's really the underpinnings of the edifice, but not anything that is visible above the ground. Finally, political. Here again, there is so much we don't know yet. The first observation is that anti-European populists are not having a great crisis. They are generally being weakened in terms of opinion polls in all countries except where they are in power, primarily Hungary and also Poland. But generally speaking, the League is not doing great. The National Rally in France is not doing that great. But again, it's far too early because the biggest political tensions coming from the pandemic are still to come. And this may or may not be when the anti-EU political forces have their moment. So I'll stop here. And again, looking forward to our discussion today.
Thank you, Nikolai. That's a very comprehensive question, and there was a lot in there. Thank you very much for answering all of that. My next question is to Istvan. Istvan, with regard to the institutions of the EU and its member states, what can be done to help recovery after the pandemic to improve the long-term economic growth and the well-being of EU citizens?
Hi, thank you very much, and welcome everyone to this panel. Let me start with taking a little bit of a bird's-eye views and also go back to the origins of why we created the European integration in the first place. I mean, we are on the eve of the Europe Day, and this celebrates the Schuman Declaration, which was made 70 years ago on the ashes of World War II, when European countries were devastated, and they were looking for ways to recover from that crisis. And the essence of the Schuman Declaration was that together we are stronger and we can create better lives for European citizens together, better than individually. Now, this message stays there and is more relevant than ever today because we are now again facing a big crisis. During World War II, we were each other's enemies. Today, we have a common enemy, which is very little. It's impossible to see with normal eyes or naked eyes, but it is actually creating a disruption to our economy, which is unprecedented since World War II. And if we want to get out of this crisis, we again need to look into what can we benefit from the European integration in addition to what countries can do individually and how that can come together. Now, if we do this, we should understand where our successes and where our failures are. I think our successes are great because, after all, Europe and the European Union is part of the most developed part of the world. But we also have failures, and some of these failures actually teaches us that there are consequences of doing certain things. So let me point to some areas that are particularly important regarding how we get out of this crisis and how we regenerate growth, wealth, and well-being for people. I mean, the essence of the European integration in the first place was the creation of the single market, trade integration, and then later on, building on this, foreign direct investment, so investment flows, and then financial integration, and everything that was building on this. Now, trade creation is fantastic. It creates growth. It unleashes innovation. It helps countries. It pushes companies to innovate and to be more competitive and more efficient. But at the same time, trade actually unleashes market forces, which, if they meet weak institutions, they are brutal and create an outcome which is very unfair. It's a kind of winner-take-all reality that is actually unsustainable. It's unsustainable economically, it's unsustainable socially, it's also unsustainable politically and environmentally. We can see this here in Boulder. I mean, Boulder and Denver area is extremely prosperous. But try to drive in the morning from Boulder to Denver on the highway. The success comes with traffic congestion, comes with environmental consequences that are not helping quality of life. In fact, they reduce our quality of life. So even successful areas of successful regions and successful countries can actually have negative implications of too fast, too much, market force driven, and where institutions don't do their own functions like infrastructure, like proper urban planning, and also the social consequences. Even within very successful communities, like here in Boulder, you have a large number of people, homeless people, in the middle of the highest income on earth you can imagine. Now imagine much less fortunate regions that cannot attract these new industries, that cannot benefit from the global trade integration, and the situation there socially is even more difficult. So my point here is that the essence of European integration, and by the way, the essence of the existence of the US, the raison d'etre for this is that we can have a more trade, better integrated economy, but it comes with some consequences unless institutions mitigate the impact of market forces, unless institutions empower some of those less fortunate regions to create an environment that can benefit and can attract innovative industries. Mika mentioned the way Italy addressed the pandemic. I think some of those were frightening periods, and everybody was really worried about what's going on. And one of the first regions that was actually hit was Veneto. More perhaps even than the rest of the country, which was the epicenter. Now, look at what happened in Veneto. They actually handled the crisis extremely well. And by the way, Veneto has an institutional quality within Italy, which is the best, and is at par with Austria and Germany, which also did very well in addressing the pandemic. So even the first reaction in addressing the medical part or the health part of the pandemic shows that the strength of institutions, including actually local, regional and local institutions, is extremely important in this regard. So the point that I want to build on this here is that if we want to get out of the crisis, of course, we need more trade. We need more trade within the EU, and that's the single market, and we need more trade in services, and particularly digital services. Because one of the answers to this crisis will be to digitalize everything we do, so we are more robust to disruptions like the current one. Now, Ignacio will tell us how difficult it is to have a trade agreement where services are involved, but let alone digital services where the global coordination and standard setting and data protection, Karen will elaborate on this, are in their infancy. Or there are very different very different approaches followed in the world. So the point here is that if we need that, the problem with institutions will be even more difficult because innovative industries, and particularly digital industries, need an ecosystem around them. Otherwise, they don't evolve. And this ecosystem only evolves and emerges in parts of the world where institutions are good, where institutions create a good environment, business environment, infrastructure, educated people, and generally, a social interaction where it's easy to create and work with such innovative and highly risky industries. Now, consequently, I think what we need here is to pay much more attention to not only giving money to countries within the EU, because that's a big part of the structural funds and development funds, but also give them hands-on help with strengthening their institutions, and not only at the national level, but also at the local level. Because there are huge differences in institutional quality across regions within countries, even in very well-developed countries that are well-developed overall, and not to mention countries that are less developed, where we have regions where, if you talk about attracting innovative industries, we have regions in Europe where there is practically none, zero, almost zero innovative. There is almost no patent registered in that part. There are no innovative companies in that part. So the bottom line is that if you go digital, if you go service-oriented, digital-oriented, the fairness of the process will become even more important. So that's the other important area where I think we need to do and more, and institutions are equally important, is human capital accumulation, and particularly higher education and the digitalization of higher education, which now becomes imperative, and universities are struggling with doing it overnight. Let me mention that my daughter just finished her global MBA, and she did it all entirely over the overnet. This was 2 years ago when she applied for this. There were very, very few leading business schools that offered online courses. In fact, this was the only one among the leading ones. Now, I'm sure after the crisis, everybody will rush there to do this, because this is how we can be much more relevant. For them, the crisis and pandemic changed nothing, because everything was on the internet. So for them, adjustment was, there was no need for adjustment because they adjusted before. So basically, what I'm trying to point out here is that the human capital accumulation will be extremely important, especially if you want to go to digital, if you want to go to service-oriented economy. And for that, again, institutions are absolutely essential, because higher education, high quality higher education, research is also highly concentrated in the parts of the world where institutions are good, and there are regions where are completely left out of the process, and this will not going to work if we move in this direction. And finally, R&D and digitalization as innovation will be also absolutely essential. And again, as I mentioned, this is an area where institutions are even more important. So at the end of the day, we all come back to one basic thing: improve institutions, but also make them much more even across countries and across regions, and watch out for the fairness of the process, because otherwise it's not going to work. The crisis already has an impact, direct impact, that is unfair and not equally distributed in the world. So with the solution getting out of the crisis, we should not even add to this problem, but rather try to mitigate this problem. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Istvan. And to our listeners, I invite you to send us your questions. We will make time at the end for as many questions as we possibly can. And now moving on to you, Ignacio, given Istvan's comments on the essentialness of institutions, and given that the US is challenging the existing system of multilateral institutions and previously signed trade agreements, and putting pressure on US companies to bring back onshore production, what should be the priorities of EU trade policy in light of the pandemic?
Very much, Felicia, and it's a big pleasure to be here talking about this subject. It's a bit difficult in 10 minutes to say everything I would like to say about the European Union trade policy. So I would like to focus essentially on 3 core priorities. The first one has to do with what should be our policy as regards the reform of multilateral institutions, and in particularly the World Trade Organization. The second one is how we can make more strategic our interaction with the United States and China. And finally, what it is that we may need to do to enhance the resilience of our trade policy. Now, before coming into these 3 topics, let me say a few words about the context. Now, European Union trade policy is probably the main instrument that the European Union has to influence the global economy. We do it through our multilateral policies, we do it through our trade agreements, and we do it through the external impact of our regulatory policies. And I think it is fair to say that we are going to be facing a much more complicated, a much more turbulent trading environment, even that the one that we have been facing over the last 4 years. I think there are 2 main parameters which are going to have an influence on how we act on trade policy. One was already there before the pandemic, and that is the US-China geopolitical conflict, which has trade and technology as its central battleground, if you want, and which inevitably impacts everyone else who is actually trading. And there the big question mark is going to be, is the situation going to be different after November? Between now and November, I think it is reasonable to assume that things will become probably, if anything, worse. If one listens to the political rhetoric in the United States, what will happen after November is a big question mark, but one can imagine 2 scenarios. One scenario which is a continuous escalation of the trade conflict in a much more difficult economic environment. The second one is the United States deciding to take a somewhat different approach about how to challenge China, to work more with its allies, and that may open different possibilities. The second element which is new is, of course, the impact of the pandemic on the economy. There's a lot of uncertainty about that, but I think most people would work on the assumption that in any case, it's going to be a recession that will be deeper than 2008, that the economies are going to come out with high levels of unemployment, with high levels of public debt, with a stronger intervention by the state in the economy. And of course, with a political debate about global value chains, should there be an effort to reshore production back? So that issues are going to be there, and that is the context in which we are going to be having to develop our trade policy. Now, my expectation, and listening what I hear from Brussels, I suspect will be our approach, is that the European Union would want to stress the need to maintain a strategic autonomy, but at the same time very much emphasizing it should be an open approach to a strategic autonomy. As a continent, we are too dependent on international trade to engage in closing down our markets. We are also institutionally deeply embedded on the importance of rules. So that's why we have always been a strongly defendant of rule-based institutions like the WTO. So I would expect that any policies that we develop in this more turbulent environment would continue to be guided by this idea of open strategic autonomy. Now, what does this mean in practice for the three priorities which I mentioned? First, on WTO reform. Now, first issue, the status quo is not an option. It would be an illusion to think that one could simply go back into the way things were at the time of the Obama administration. No matter what is politically decided in the United States, in order for the WTO to regain relevance in the world of trade, it would need to reform. I would expect that politically we would be strongly investing in this exercise of WTO reform. And I would say from my own personal perspective, three main planks which I could see could be the platform that we would be putting forward. The first one is mainly aimed at trying to ensure that the WTO regains credibility as a forum for negotiations, and that it does so through agreements which are relevant in the post-COVID recovery context. I think there are three areas where I believe it should not be too difficult if there is goodwill from the main trading partners to achieve outcomes in the WTO. One is something that has been discussed. Well, let me start with the issue of health. I mean, now there's a clear need to have a discussion in the WTO about the role of the WTO to better contribute to the coordination of policies in the context of a pandemic. There's ideas which have already been put forward by Commissioner Hogan, and I think these are likely to be further developed, looking not only into things like the liberalization of tariffs, but looking also into issues like export restrictions, like different types of NTBs that can interfere with the allocation of resources in the context of a pandemic. So a trade and health initiative is something that I believe the WTO, perhaps in a plurilateral setting, should be able to deliver in the short term. The two other initiatives have to do with the whole issue about how the WTO is relevant towards the objectives of sustainable development. And those are negotiations on fisheries subsidies which have been taking place for quite some time, and where I hope that it will be possible between now and the WTO ministerial to get into an outcome. And the second one is an issue that was already discussed a few years ago, but in the current context of the transition towards the climate neutrality becomes even more relevant, which is the elimination of tariffs on environmental goods. I have mentioned those three issues because those are issues in which, quite frankly, one would hope that the United States and China would be able to cooperate with the EU and other countries to get a meaningful outcome between now and the time of the next WTO ministerial. Of course, these do not really come to the core of the problems which are behind the conflict between the United States and China. There are issues which are going to be much more complicated, issues like subsidies, industrial subsidies, but I would expect we will also need to discuss agricultural subsidies, and those issues are not going to be solved very shortly. But I think at least a process of opening up negotiations on those matters is something that should be developed between now and the next ministerial meeting of the WTO. Now, that is what I think should be our fundamental objective in terms of our multilateral policy. But of course, a lot depends here on what is also going to be the position of the United States and what is going to be the position of China. We can't exercise as much influence as we can. We can try to have as many countries supporting our policies as we can, but at the end of the day, on certain issues, we should really try to exercise our influence to try to get the US and China on board, which is the reason why I think a more strategic approach to our relationships with the United States and China is going to be the second big priority. I will not talk too much about China. I can come into that if you want in the debate. I will just say that vis-a-vis the United States, I really think that there are three main priorities that we should be developing. The first one is to try to find a common transatlantic basis for WTO reform. If the United States and the European Union get their act together, we still can play a very influential role in how to steer the reform of the trade organization. And I think that should be the top political priority in the engagement between the United States and the European Union. The second one is regulation. Now, we are a regulatory power, have a strong influence in the world, this famous Brussels effect. The United States, of course, is a very important regulatory power, but increasingly China is a critical global player when it comes to regulation in the digital economy, when it comes to regulation in the green economy. And I think that we should really have a strategic interest in being able to cooperate much more closely with the United States when it comes to global regulation. For a number of reasons, we have not been very successful on this. We are a little bit captured by the narcissism of small differences, but I believe that this strategic cooperation on regulation is something where there is a huge scope for stronger transatlantic partnerships. The other issue is the whole linkage between trade and security. Now, this is something which is very present in the conflict between the United States and China. It is something on which, again, potentially there could be conflicts between the United States and the European Union. And the more that we can establish a dialogue on the trade and security nexus, the more that we should be able to hopefully limit the scope for transatlantic conflicts in this area. Finally, I want to come to this question of resilience. Now, we are going to be living in a turbulent world. Now, the best case scenario is in a scenario in which the United States understands that it is better to deal with China in cooperation with allies, that China understands that the status quo is not an option, that if they wanted to play a role internationally on the trade front, they need to accept the need for reform, and where we can channel the energy in the direction of negotiations in a multilateral setting. That is plan A. That is the best scenario, but of course, it depends on political factors which are not under our control. It depends on what the political direction the United States will want to follow, what reactions the Chinese leadership will want to take. And of course, at this point in time, the omens are not very good. So I think we need to prepare for all scenarios, including a scenario in which we find that our most desired approach is not working, at least not in the short term. And that's why I think we need to enhance our resilience. I will be just very telegraphic on this because I think I'm already exceeding my time limit. I will just say three things. First, even in that scenario, I think we should continue to engage in the WTO. Of course, it's very unlikely that we should be able to get big agreements in which both the United States and China participate. But part of the beauty about what is happening now in the WTO is there's an increasing openness towards plurilateral agreements. And I could imagine that on certain issues, we would reach plurilateral agreements without the United States. It's something that we have done, for instance, in the field of dispute settlement. And in some areas, we may be able to reach plurilateral agreements without China. So we should try, even in the worst case scenario, to continue to engage with as many countries as possible to maintain at least a functioning WTO system. Second point is Africa and the neighborhood. Now, we have developed a very strong network of trade agreements. We have 40 free trade agreements in the world. I think one area where we need to put much more emphasis and to invest much more is to develop a stronger partnership with the countries in the neighborhood and the countries in Africa. For many reasons, political, economics. And I would just say that there are two issues which I think we need to reflect about what we can do more. What we can do more on the regulatory cooperation field. Those are countries which are obviously very closely dependent on trade with Europe, which means that what we do in the regulatory field has a huge influence on them. Can we do more in terms of regulatory cooperation with countries in the neighborhood and with countries in Africa? And secondly, what it is that we can do by looking into all our tools to foster more investment in the neighborhood. Now, there's a lot in Africa. There's a lot of debate about reshoring. I mean, I think that part of this debate in Europe should be what can be done to facilitate regional value chains that include Africa and the neighborhood. Finally, we need to be ready for the risk that situations could become more complicated. We should not engage in protectionism. We should not engage in actions which are against our WTO obligations. We should not be naive. We should be able to have the tools to act when it is needed. And I think that there are particularly two fields in which I would imagine that we would probably want to strengthen our current instruments. One is how to respond to subsidies to third countries, including the impact on the single market of those subsidies. And secondly is investment screening. This is something that we are going to start implementing now because we have a new legislation that was adopted on investment screening. But I think there's beginning to be a debate where this is enough and where we need to have a stronger instruments to control certain types of investment which may have an impact on our economic security. So I would leave it at that for the time being.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ignacio. Incredible points. Really appreciate all of your comments. I'm going to go back to something that Istvan talked about, the ecosystem of the digital services. And I'm going to pose this question to you, Karen. The EU introduced a globally unique data privacy protection regime. The fight against the pandemic will require new applications that are heavily reliant on data. Do you see a conflict with the general data protection regulation?
Yes, thank you, Felicia. And thank you also for having me and for taking this initiative of bringing together EU fellows in this talk. Being here in the United States, I realize that for Americans, it's sometimes surprising to see how Europeans have such strong feelings about data protection and privacy. And we have indeed, as you said, a quite strong regulatory framework in place. Now, the history to these strong feelings goes back quite a while. It goes back to the Second World War, where personal data were used to or abused to identify people that should go to the concentration camps. It goes back to the Cold War, where the Stasi, which was East Germany's secret police, was notorious for exerting control over people on the basis of sometimes very intimate data that were gathered on such an enormous scale. So we have strong feelings in Europe about data protection and privacy, and it explains also why these rights are in the European Convention of Human Rights and are also in our EU Fundamental Rights Charter. Whereas in the United States, perhaps similar feelings or need for the protection of personal data may have been less, at least felt less urgently. And those privacy concerns have not diminished over time. Where they started as a protection against state action, now Europeans also see even more serious risks when it comes to private companies collecting and using our data. Now, coming then to today, and indeed the pandemic, I think it's generally recognized that digital tools can play an important role in getting a way out of the pandemic, or at least leaving confinement. Many mobile applications and technologies are being discussed today. With several applications, some of them just give information and advice to citizens, but others, which are more at the forefront of the news today, permit to contact or to track actually people's proximity and close contacts and warn people if they have been in contact with an infected person. Now you can imagine even further applications. You can use the mobile data also to monitor and enforce confinement of infected persons. So you can imagine quite a broad application of all these technologies. When it comes to contact tracing, because that's the main one which is being discussed now, obviously it would be an advantage. It would add value to the traditional method of manual contact tracing, which is already used in cases of pandemics, but where you need quite a lot of public health officials. You need to, it's time consuming, of course, because you need to trace the people. You need to be able to speak to the infected person, which may not always be easy, as if you hear the effects that the disease can have on people. That person must also remember who he has been in contact with for 2 weeks, may not have the contact details, and may just not know the people that have been in close contact. So that's at the very individual or small bubble level, but of course the data could also be used more broadly to establish modeling and to predict the evolution of the virus. So to somehow describe or find out the spatial dynamics of the virus. And you see around the world many countries that have started experimenting and developing such technology, not only in Europe, also here in the United States and in Asia specifically. Now, I think one thing that most people or most people agree on is that in order for such technology to be useful, first of all, and effective, people must use it. And in order for people to use it, they must trust it. People must use it. There are studies, various studies around about the level of user penetration going from 60% to more. I read recently, for instance, in Singapore, they have less than 20% take-up of the technology, whereas they estimate that they need 75% of the population for it to be useful. But so for people to use it, as I said, people must trust it. And there you come to our European sensitivity to privacy and data protection. We want to make sure, and I'm sure and I see here in the debates in the United States as well, similar concerns are being issued, are being expressed. We want to make sure that the data is secure, that it is kept confidential. We want to know that the data is only used to alert individuals who have been exposed to the virus, that it's not used for other purposes, not for commercial purposes, not for mass surveillance, which may be a risk in other countries. And we also want to know that, or be sure that the data is useful, that actually based on these data, public health authorities are able to act on to take action. And then particularly when you think about Europe, where we have a pretty small territory with 27 different sovereign countries, we want to make sure that the data is interoperable. And for instance, the Luxembourg Parliament decided just yesterday that they'd rather not have a digital app, because people in Luxembourg, they work in Germany, they work in France, they work in Belgium. If everybody's taking a different app, what's the use of the of that app for the people that actually cross borders all the time? Now, how does our legal framework come into place there? Well, I think that I can say that in Europe, we are actually quite fortunate to have a legal framework in place, which helps us and guides us basically in the development and the use of such technology, and to answer some of all these difficult questions and concerns that we have with the use of this technology. And the European Commission has been actually working very hard on these matters. They have issued just a couple of days ago guidance on the overarching principles that should be followed when developing and using such apps. And those guidance gives these principles, which include, for instance, just to give a few examples, that the use of the app should be voluntary. So people should choose to participate as a token of collective responsibility, but they cannot be forced to participate. Also, there should be no negative consequences for those that decide not to participate. Other principles are, for instance, the use of the app should be temporary. And so the app should even be automatically deactivated once the pandemic is over. The data should be anonymized. So when people are warned that they have been in close contact with someone, they should, the identity of the sick person would not be released, nor the identity of the people that have been in close contact. What is also very important guidance is that the data, the technology should not enable to locate people. So it should rather be based on Bluetooth technology that permits to define proximity, but not on geolocation data, because that we would find disproportionate and not needed actually for the goal that this is pursuing. There are many other guidelines there. One important one that I also will mention is that the guidelines go that we should avoid the centralized storage of data. So the data should remain on each device and not be in a central server. And so all these data and all these guidelines, they help in developing and in using the data and the technology. For instance, if you see in the United Kingdom, they had started already experimenting with a certain technology, which was based on a centralization of all the data in a cloud. And following the concerns that have been expressed with that, they are now moving to a decentralized system based on the guidelines. And you see that even companies are looking at the guidelines. Deutsche Telekom and SAP who are working on the German version of the app. They are following the guidelines, but even here in the United States, Apple and Google, who have joined forces to develop an app, have also indicated that they will follow these guidelines and require consent, ensure the anonymity of the data, etc. So in response to your question, I would say that there is no conflict between data protection and the use of such technologies. It is perfectly possible to use and develop such technologies while preserving data protection and fundamental rights. And I think we are quite fortunate in Europe to have at least a legal framework in place which permits to guide us in that direction.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your answer, Karen. Now, you mentioned that there are different approaches and that we're going to see countries using different ways to gain comparative advantage, sort of to gain this data privacy. My next question is to Ignacio, building on what you said. You know, before the COVID, we were experiencing, the EU was experiencing the Brexit. In your opinion, Ignacio, will the UK use a different approach, I mean, different from the EU, to gain some comparative advantage against the EU in this area? If so, will this have an impact on the post-Brexit arrangement between the EU and the UK?
Yeah, well, thank you very much. And let me start by saying, absolutely, in my opinion, I haven't had an opportunity to discuss with my colleagues which are involved on the Brexit negotiations. So what I would share with you is just my own personal views. Now, first is as regards UK trade policy, UK has chosen to develop an independent trade policy. That's something which is their right to do. I don't think, quite frankly, that people in Brussels are very concerned one way or the other. We already have a network of 40 free trade agreements. Most of those countries would want to know first what is the future relationship between the UK and the EU before they decide what they want to negotiate with the UK. I said most. It's not the case for the United States. I know that the United States has started now to negotiate with the UK the trade agreement. I mean, I used to be chief negotiator for the TTIP. I wish good luck to my UK friends. But I don't think that on this issue there is much anxiety or much concern in Brussels about the choices that the UK may take. Where I think there is a concern, which is based on political statements which have been made in the UK, is about the risk that the UK develops in the future a regulatory model which is much less protective than the one that it used to have as a member of the European Union. And this is simply based on political statements which have been made by those who have been behind the Brexit project. That's the reason why in the context of the negotiations of the trade agreement between the UK and the EU, an issue which I think is going to be critical and is probably going to be also the most difficult is this question about how to ensure a level playing field. Now, what does this mean in practice? Basically, to simplify it to things, there is all those regulations we related to the protection of the environment, food safety, and labor rights, essentially, where basically what we would expect the UK is not to lower the level of protection below what it used to have as a member of the European Union. By the way, this would also apply to the European Union. So there will be what is called a non-regression clause, a commitment not to go below the level of protection which was there when the UK was a member of the European Union. And then there's another issue which I think is also going to be complicated, although it's a little bit paradoxical, which is state aid. One of the main disciplines for the functioning of the European market is that all member states have been subject to strict disciplines on the state aid. In the past, by the way, the UK was one of the strongest defenders of those disciplines. But again, now I think it's not very clear what the direction the UK government would think. So we would want to be sure that there is a strong state aid discipline within the framework of the trade agreement. Now, that's what our mandate says, that what the Council has asked the Commission to negotiate. It's probably going to be the single most difficult aspect of the negotiations with the United Kingdom. I will not make a prediction about what the outcome would be. I think one should basically leave the negotiators to the negotiation. But I think that that's the concern. As I said, it's not the trade agreement that the UK may be negotiating. It is the risk that the UK decides to deregulate in a direction that creates an unlevel playing field in competition with the countries in the European Union, and of course with a country which is right in our borders. So it is something we are obviously much more concerned when we are negotiating with the UK and when we are negotiating with other countries.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much, Ignacio, for answering that question. Now, Istvan, you mentioned before that let's say this. The EU has not been particularly successful in establishing a significant position in digital technologies, and more generally, maintaining its traditionally strong position globally in innovation. Now, what you did mention is the uneven institutional quality among and within its member states is one of the major factors explaining the development. What can be done to reverse this trend and keep up with the traditional, like US, Japan, and the newly emerging, like South Korea, China, Israel, global innovator countries? What do you think, Istvan?
Well, I think this is the biggest challenge we face. And I think the problem of the EU are actually kind of two-sided. The cutting edge and those, left behind. And there's a problem also with the cutting edge, or at least in some cases. So if you look into why and how Europe kind of slightly lost its position and certainly could not keep up with the new emerging global innovators, such as South Korea, China, India, Israel, Singapore, that our cutting edge is not as sharp as it used to be relative to others. So particularly the share of European countries in the global patent market, the US patent market, overall actually declined slightly, but our top innovator country, which is Germany, actually lost significantly market shares. Luckily enough, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Austria, so the small and countries with extremely high quality institutions and very even institutions inside the countries, could make up partly for this loss, but not entirely. And having the cutting edge in kind of globally important players is extremely important. Let me just mention the fact that in 2018, South Korea had more US patents than Germany in absolute numbers. So things are, I mean, this is just changing rapidly, and to keep up for this is absolutely important on the cutting edge. And then, comes to the left behind regions where there's practically no innovation as such. So the same applies actually to higher education, because part of the innovation is actually done by universities, and obviously universities supply the highly qualified labor that you need in order to do research and innovative activities. Now, again, if you look into what happened to European universities in the global competition, look into any ranking of the research quality of European institutions, European universities, what we see is that Europe's position slightly declined, but within this, again, the cutting edge, some of the cutting edge was taken away. And again, I can point to, for example, German universities, which are still very strong, very solid, but when it comes to the cutting edge and keeping up with the emergence of new competitors is something that needs to be further sharpened. So we have to do things on both ends of the distribution. And in higher education, this is particularly an area where Europe has very good universities when it comes to overall teaching and having a mobility, having international orientation of universities. But when it comes to the cutting edge research, we are not improving, and the new countries are coming up in that area too tremendously and very, very fast. So traditional Japanese universities were there. Of course, that was the first shock to the developed world that another country can take over the leading role. But now it's Chinese and Singaporean universities and South Korean universities coming up and showing strengths that are kind of sending us the message that unless we keep up with this, we will not be able to. Luckily enough, European Union has strong initiatives in both areas, and particularly the new initiative of what is called European universities. But again, this is at this stage is focusing on students, which is very important, the curriculum and the mobility and all these things, and campuses where people can mix and virtually or in physical reality. Now we have to extend this to the cutting edge research and innovation part of them, because that is also essential.
Thank you, Istvan. I'm now going to turn to some of the more social dimensions of the pandemic. And Karen, this question is directed to you. In light of your work in the area of gender equality, is there a gender aspect to the current crisis? How do you see the impact of the current crisis on women?
Yes, thank you. Another fundamental right indeed, next to data protection and privacy, we have gender equality. Now, I think the pandemic is showing quite the different realities for men and women. And I think on this point, perhaps the situation in the United States and in Europe is not that different. First of all, well, the pandemic shows that, at least the preliminary data show that more men are dying for various reasons that may that are not yet entirely sure, either related to genetics, to a less healthy lifestyle, more smoking, more excessive use of alcohol. But it's clear that men are more at risk of having a serious disease when they get infected with the virus. Now, that doesn't mean that the pandemic has a more effect on men than on women, and I think that the contrary is true. First of all, I think it's worth noting that those that are at the forefront of fighting against this pandemic are women. In the EU, most of the nurses and healthcare workers are women. They are risking their lives and their lives of their families in taking care of people. And I think that's something that should not be underscored. And this, while they are in a profession, which at least in Europe, is among the less valued and the less paid in the economy. So that's the first effect that we can see. We see other effects. We see And another negative effect definitely is the increase or the intensification of domestic violence. The data we have in Europe, we see that the calls to helplines are increasing sometimes dramatically. So it's clear that the lockdown, keeping the women and inside, exposes them much more to their abusers. Before they could get out, they could have the respite of work, and also the stress that currently is in society, and that this lockdown is also creating, makes abusers more volatile. They may feel the privacy of the home, they may feel more that they are impune. So definitely the fight against the pandemic, the domestic abuse and violence, but also the economic consequences of the crisis are likely to have a disproportionate impact on women. At least in Europe, the economic sectors where women are overrepresented, such as leisure, hospitality, education, and health sectors, they are female sectors. Secondly, women also most have more precarious jobs, and it's even more for non-EU born women, so migrant women. They have also more the low-paid jobs, the part-time jobs, and these are jobs that definitely are suffering. So we see a lot of impacts for women. Also, what I should mention, the closure of the schools and the childcare and the unavailability of grandparents reinforces some structural inequalities were already there. In inequality in the sharing of caring work. For instance, in Europe, we know that women, working women, they report 22 hours of unpaid work per week, which is domestic work, household work, caring work, whereas men report 9 hours per week of such work. So there is already this inequality, but with the childcare facilities, the schools that are closed, the grandparents that are no longer there, this is even more exacerbated. And then there are many impacts that people may just not be aware of. For instance, we have data in Europe showing also that women rely much more than men on the use of public transportation. Now, public transportation is something that has become quite in these times, because we know that you're more exposed to the virus on public transportation. And all this, knowing that the pandemic is disproportionately having an impact on women, and women are not taking part in the decisions to confront the pandemic, because we know also, and I guess it's not very different here, that in Europe, at least in governments, in European parliaments, the women represent only 30% of the people. We have 27 member states. Well, we have only 4 female heads of government in Germany, in Belgium, in Finland, and in Denmark. So we see that this many of these structural equalities already exist. So they are not new, but they are exacerbated by this crisis. Now we are doing, of course, we try in the Commission to do a lot. For instance, one of the things we are currently doing is sharing best practices on how to address the domestic violence. For instance, protection and support services for women have been declared essential services in a number of member states. And quite ingenious new mechanisms are found. For instance, I can mention in Belgium, Spain, and France, they developed an alert mechanism whereby women can call for help in a coded way. So they can call their pharmacist, for instance, and use a certain code word like mask 19, and the pharmacist will know that this is a call for help, basically, in a situation where the person may not be able to contact the police herself because the abuser is always around. So yeah, there definitely is a gendered impact. I think it's here as well. And it just shows that we have to pay, in getting out of this pandemic, we have to pay special attention to this impact in the measures we develop.
Great. Thank you so much, Karen. Thank you. Nicholas, one final question, and we're kind of running out of time, but I still want to give you the opportunity to answer this. How would the deepening of financial integration position in the EU globally in light of the crisis that the pandemic causes? How would the deepening of the financial integration position the EU globally?
So it's, I think it's linked to broader issues of deepening of EU integration, right? So as I said in my introductory remarks, the way the pandemic will play out in terms of financial integration, banking union, capital markets union, and also related issues within the Eurozone, within the single market, is far too early to judge. So we haven't come to the point yet when we know how these things will be affected by the pandemic and the crisis response, if at all. What we know is that there has been an aspiration of the European Union and specifically the Eurozone to develop an international role for the Euro that has taken prominence, increased prominence in the last few years. And that's become official policy, I think, of the European Commission to develop the international role of the Euro, implicitly to diminish Europe's reliance on the dominant international role of the dollar. And obviously, the #1 item on the agenda to develop the international role of the Euro is to create a more integrated, more vibrant financial system, which goes with these themes of financial integration, banking union, capital markets union. Now I will also say this. I think realistically, the international role of the Euro will remain limited in scope as long as the dollar keeps its current dominance and as the Eurozone doesn't become a really integrated fiscal union, which is not going probably to happen anytime soon, certainly in the current political conditions. One key driver of this, somewhat ironically in the next few years, is not so much the actions that the Eurozone or the EU could take, but rather the US presidential election. Because if the Trump administration is reelected, it has had a very aggressive use of financial sanctions and very unpredictable use of financial sanctions. And that could create a risk for the dominance of the dollar, because the dollar, the international rule of the US dollar could become affected by a perception of riskiness, which it hasn't had certainly since World War II. So that's in a way a move back to our American host, because it could be that the main driver of whether the Euro takes a more international role in the years ahead comes not from home, but rather from what happens in the US, depending on US political developments. I'll leave it there. You're on mute. We don't hear you.
Sorry. Thank you. Thank you. So I have unmuted all of the mics for the panelists, and I'd like to pose these 3 questions from our audience. We'll start with the first one. Sweden is an outlier in the EU with respect to their handling of COVID-19. How do the other EU members view Sweden's approach and its effects, financial or otherwise, on the rest of Europe? I open that up. Who would like to answer that?
Maybe I can pick this up, because I used to be actually the director for Sweden for 8 years in DG ECFIN. So I have a bit of experience. And I mean, first of all, about this example or this case, it shows that it's very important that countries experiment with different approaches, because we don't know what the right answer is to any such big, challenge like the COVID crisis, and particularly how the economy should be handled in the workplace, and companies, how should they run. So I think it's important that countries have the opportunity to experiment. Also, Sweden is a country with the highest quality of institutions in the world, and underlying this, trust by people in their own government is very, very high, and interpersonal trust level is very, very high. So this is a society where individuals can actually implement solutions without the government imposing too much of restrictions on them, or they can follow advice and behave responsibly and try to handle the situation this way, and not wait for the government and police to come there and tell them what to do or what not to do. So again, this is a different society, this is a different setting where this kind of solution may work, and it seems that they are doing relatively well, if not worse than countries that have more restrictive regime, and certainly the economic implications will be much less severe. So this is an example from which we can learn other countries, and also we need to understand why one country can go for one solution and another country can go for another solution, needs to go for another solution. And in terms of what impact for the others has, the positive impact is that a stronger Swedish economy helps everyone, that's for sure. Where the problem starts is, of course, when you want to cross the border, because there is someone on the other side of the border. So you may decide to liberalize things on your side, but the other side will have to. So coordination and European coordination in this regard is obviously essential. But let me mention that even in the most restrictive part of the COVID crisis, services and goods were freely flowing through borders. So that was not stopped. So if Swedish economy is doing well, at least the neighbors will certainly benefit from this.
Great. And then the next question, we're going to go a little bit over because I think it's important to answer these final two questions. What do the panelists see as the future of EU leadership on climate change and greening the economy in a post-COVID world? Who would like to answer that?
You're muted, Ignacio.
Ignacio, you're muted.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes,
Yeah.
we can. Thank you.
Okay, well, I will just give a partial response, but I'm sure others might also want to say something on this. Now, I think that the recovery from the pandemic is going to be fundamentally about investment. And it makes more sense that if you are going to focus on investment, you should focus on investments which contribute towards the goals of the climate transition. So I'm sure that the way that the European Commission would see this is that the fact that we are going to need to recover from the pandemic should in no way retract from the policies that would lead towards the objective of achieving climate neutrality in the European Union. Now, this is not going to be simple. I think that there are certainly going to be industries that probably would not be happy about that, who would be arguing against it. There may even be some member states who would not want to go in that direction. So I think there will be a political debate about this. But my impression is that the view of the Commission would be that we should maintain the direction that we have set in terms of the Green New Deal. And of course, that means that we should also try to see how we can lead internationally. I mean, obviously, it would be much better if we had engagement from the United States. Let's see what happens in November. The United States is not only the federal government, so I think even in the current circumstances, there are actions in the United States which are constructive. We need to see how to cooperate with China. One of the reasons why we cannot have a pure confrontation strategy with China is that China is a necessary player for any solution on the climate transition. So we need to see how to cooperate with China. Now, I think that this whole issue of greening the Green New Deal is going to impact on all European policies. It's going to impact also trade policy. Just to give you two examples, I think there's going to be a big discussion about the introduction of border carbon measures. That's something on which the Commission will come with a proposal, I think, at some point in time next year, where we are currently doing an impact assessment, and we want to be sure that what we propose is consistent with WTO rules. But again, we're sure that this is going to be an issue that will give rise to controversy, that will give rise to discussions. And I mentioned before that one of the key issues that we need to look at in terms of international rules is subsidies. But of course, rules on subsidies is not only stricter rules for certain types of subsidies which are clearly trade distortive. It's also, from my point of view, to try to define a green box to identify those types of subsidies which are positive reactions towards the needs to internalize environmental costs. And I think you would need to find internationally a balance between the two elements.
Thank you, Ignacio. And then Karen, the final question I believe is directed to the comments that you made about technology and tracking folks. The question is it also necessary to be clear that everyone can access the use of technology, which in aging societies such as ours, Uruguay, and Europeans, is not so evident?
Yes, of course. Perhaps I should have been clearer on that. It's clear that accessibility is an issue, and we know that certain groups of people will have less access. We think not only the elderly, but also people that are disabled. And so I should be clear that the use of technology in will only complement manual tracing. I mean, traditionally, we've been doing this on a manual basis, and that will continue, in particular, to reach those groups of people that will not be able to use the technology. I think that's clear. Perhaps I can just add something on the question of Sweden and just say that next week on Tuesday, actually, the Institute of European Studies in Berkeley is having a seminar on the handling of the pandemic in Sweden. So for those that are interested, you can zoom in on that one.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Karen. Well, we're going to close now, and I'd like to express our deep thanks to our panelists, Istvan, Karen, Ignacio, Nikolai. Thank you so much for joining us today. Again, to our listeners, this webinar is one of two this week in honor of Europe Day. There are activities tomorrow, which you can attend online, of course, at EU in the US. You can find that on their Facebook page, EU in the US. And you're invited to join. I'm going to end this meeting for now. Thank you again, panelists. We sure appreciate your time and answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.